This beanie is really easy to make. You make it using the Tunisian simple stitch to create a rectangle of fabric, sew the ends together and cinch the top to create the beanie, and the edge can be folded over to create a rather attractive brim. The reverse side of the simple stitch is different to the front, and it has a ribbed appearance which is perfect for the brim of a beanie. This is the yarn I used. It is 100% acrylic double knit yarn that recommends a 4mm hook, but I actually used a 7mm Tunisian crochet hook that's about 14 inches long, and with Tunisian crochet you would generally use a hook 2 to 3mm larger than in ordinary crochet. So to start, you just create a slip knot, slide the hook through it and tighten, and then create a chain that is around 10 inches long, and in this case I needed to chain 40. The next step is to cast on, and in this case I used the top loop rather than the back bump. The reason being is that the rationale for this beanie is a really easy beanie to make, and casting on using the top loop is easier than using the back bump. And if casting on through all the stitches, there should be 40 loops on the hook, 1 stitch per loop. And here we have 40 loops on the hook. The next step on the return row is to chain 1, and I always like to mark the end of the row with a stitch marker just to make sure that the edges remain neat without creating or dropping any stitches. And then yarn over, pull through 2 loops, yarn over, pull through 2 loops, etc., as in the normal Tunisian crochet return pass. At the end of the return pass, it is time to cast on, and for this we do the Tunisian simple stitch, and that is by pushing the hook through the second front vertical bar, yarning over, pulling through, and through the next front vertical bar, yarning over, pulling through, etc., all the way along to the end of the row. And just keep on going until the fabric builds up to a length of around 21 to 22 inches. This beanie is designed for a man's head, and a man's head is usually between 22 and 24 inches in circumference. If the piece of fabric was the same length as the circumference of the head, then it would be too loose because the fabric has a little bit of stretch in it. The Tunisian simple stitch doesn't produce a particularly stretchy fabric, but there is stretch in it, and creating a length of 21 to 22 inches is perfect for a head circumference of 24 inches. So once you're happy with the length of the fabric, as in this case, it is time to cast off for the last time, and when you reach the end of the row, the edge needs to be neatened up. And this is achieved by binding off by slip stitching into each vertical front loop. So you're effectively slip stitching into a Tunisian simple stitch. This creates a very neat top. top to the fabric. And then when you reach the end of the row, pull through a nice long piece of yarn that will be adequate for sewing up the seam of the beanie. Now double checking the length of the fabric, and it is 22 inches, which is absolutely perfect. Before the seam is sewn together, it is best to add some stitch markers just to make sure that the edges meet properly. The aim when sewing up the seam is to produce a join that is not particularly visible. I have to admit that with this project I started off using a mattress stitch that was a bit of a disaster because it produced a ridge which was very obvious, and I undid it and then did a simple whip stitch which actually looked okay. So basically, in my view, when sewing up a seam, it's really a bit of trial and error to produce the best aesthetic result. And here is the seam. It doesn't look too bad at all. Just having a look at the top and bottom of this tube to see what the nicest edge will be for the brim, and the untidy edge is in fact the one with the long piece of yarn from the seam, and there is probably enough to use it to cinch the top of the beanie. And to do that I'm going in and out of the chain stitches, and after every few stitches pulling the yarn tight to draw the fabric in, although you have to be a bit careful in this case as the yarn used is in continuity with that to sew up the seam. So if you pull too tight, you can pull the seam tight as well to produce a rather disfiguring contracture to the beanie. So I'm just pulling the yarn and I'm going to give the seam a bit of gentle stretch just to prevent a nasty contracture developing. There will inevitably be a small hole at the top of the beanie, so I'm just going to weave the yarn in and out over the hole to close it up. There's still quite a nice length of yarn left, so you could either use this to attach a pom-pom, but in this case I'm not going to have a pom-pom. I'm just going to sew the yarn through to the other side of the beanie and then weave it in to secure it. And I think the top of the beanie looks quite acceptable. But the edge here at the bottom of the seam needs a bit of attention as it looks rather untidy. I'm just going to join the two sides of the gap by creating a loop by stitching it that should be cosmetically acceptable, and then weave this bit of yarn in to secure it. And I think I've achieved a very acceptable cosmetic result here. And here it is, the easy Tunisian simple stitch beanie. The last thing to do, of course, is to weave in the remaining ends of yarn.